When I bought the house, it felt like a fresh start. My husband, Ben, worked construction jobs out of state and wasn't home much, so the cozy little place seemed perfect for me to settle in while he was away. It was small but charming, a craftsman-style home with wide front steps, a wraparound porch, and a big yard for the garden I'd always wanted. The only downside was the age of the house. Built in the 1940s, it came with creaky floors, drafty windows, and a musty smell that lingered no matter how much I cleaned. My dad joked that old houses came with character, but the creaks and groans at night made it hard to appreciate. I spent my first week unpacking, hanging pictures, and imagining how I'd fix it up over time. I loved it until the noises started. It began on a Thursday night. I just finished washing the dishes and was sitting in the living room scrolling through Pinterest when I heard it. Faint scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind brushing tree branches against the side of the house. The noise seemed to come from the wall behind me, so I walked outside with a flashlight to check. But there were no trees close enough to touch the house. The scratching came again the next night. This time, it was louder and seemed to move, first behind the living room wall, then closer to the hallway. Probably mice, I told myself, though the sound was too deliberate, too sharp for tiny paws. I made a mental note to call an exterminator, but life got busy, and I forgot. By the weekend, the noises had escalated. Scratching turned into soft thuds, and I swore I heard faint footsteps at night, as if someone were walking beneath the floor. By the second week, I couldn't ignore it any longer. My husband wasn't due back for another month, and I hated the idea of dealing with a pest problem alone, but I needed answers. On Saturday morning, I gathered my courage and headed to the basement. It was unfinished, with exposed beams, cobwebs in the corners, and a cold, damp smell that made me shiver. I brought a flashlight and my phone, ready to call for help if I found anything unusual. At first, everything looked normal, just the old furnace, some storage boxes, and a pile of tools left by the previous owner. Then I noticed it. A small crawlspace door near the back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of old paint cans. The door was wooden, no more than 3 feet high, with a rusted metal latch. I'd never noticed it before. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved the cans aside and crouched down to unlatch the door. It creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel that smelled of damp earth. I aimed my flashlight inside and froze. There was a makeshift bed, a tattered sleeping bag on top of cardboard, surrounded by empty water bottles and crumpled snack wrappers. Someone had been living there. My stomach churned as I backed away, heart pounding. I locked the crawlspace door and ran upstairs, calling the police. 2 officers arrived within minutes. They searched the basement and the crawlspace but found no one. Probably a squatter, one of them said, jotting down notes. We'll keep an eye on the area, but it doesn't look like they're here now. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. Someone had been under my house, eating, sleeping, and listening to me go about my life, completely unaware. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. I kept the lights on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. 3 days passed without incident. I started to convince myself that the squatter had moved on until the 4th night. It was nearly midnight, and I was brushing my teeth when I heard it again, scratching. This time, it was coming from directly below me. I stood frozen in the bathroom, listening as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then came the faint sound of breathing, heavy, labored breaths just below the floor. I ran to my room, locked the door, and called 911. When the police arrived, they found him, a man in his 40s, disheveled and gaunt, hiding in the crawlspace. He had a knife and a notebook filled with disturbing notes about me, my routines, what I ate, even what I wore to bed. The man was arrested, but I couldn't stay in that house. The thought of him watching me Waiting for the right moment was too much to bear. To this day, I double-check every door, every lock, and every corner of my home. I never want to feel that vulnerable again. It was the winter of 2004. I was 19, living alone in a cabin tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd taken a gap year after high school to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. My parents thought I was crazy for choosing such isolation, but to me, it felt like freedom. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who let me stay there rent-free as long as I maintained the place. It was simple, no internet, no TV, just a fireplace, a gas stove, and a small collection of books. I spent my days hiking, writing in my journal, and working part-time at a diner in the nearest town, about 15 miles away. Winter had come early that year, blanketing the woods in snow. By late December, the roads were barely drivable, and I'd started spending most of my time indoors. I didn't mind. The quiet was peaceful, and the fire kept the cabin warm and cozy. But everything changed the night of the first blizzard. The wind howled as I sat by the fire, a mug of hot chocolate in hand. Snow battered the windows, and the cabin creaked under the weight of the storm. It was the kind of night that made you grateful to be indoors. Around 11 p.m., I decided to head to bed. As I got up to turn off the lights, something caught my eye, a faint smudge on the sliding glass door that led to the porch. The porch light was off, so I couldn't see clearly, but the smudge looked like a handprint. My first thought was that it was mine, left there earlier in the day. But as I stepped closer, I realized something was off. The handprint was too large, much larger than mine, and it was fresh, the moisture glistening in the faint light of the fire. My heart raced. Who would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm? I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the door, but the beam only reflected off the glass. I couldn't see anything beyond it. I locked the door and checked the other windows, making sure they were secure. Then I turned off the lights and went to bed, telling myself it was nothing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the cabin. I froze, straining to hear over the howling wind. The steps were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Gripping the flashlight, I crept out of bed and peered out the window. The snow was still falling heavily, but I could make out the faint outline of a figure standing near the edge of the porch, just beyond the reach of the light. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. Backed away from the window, heart pounding. I didn't have a phone, the cabin didn't have service, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. Then louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I grabbed the fire poker and stood near the door, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on the living room window. I turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. A face was pressed against the glass, pale and distorted by the frost. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a strange intensity. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the rug. The face disappeared, and the footsteps resumed, circling the cabin again. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, shoving the dresser against the door. The footsteps continued for hours, sometimes stopping near the windows, sometimes near the door. At one point, I thought I heard the doorknob rattling, but I was too terrified to check. The storm finally subsided around dawn, and with it, the footsteps stopped. When the sun rose, I gathered the courage to look outside. The snow was littered with footprints, circling the cabin again and again. They led to the windows, the porch, even the back door. But there were no tracks leading away. Whoever had been out there was either still hiding or had vanished into thin air. I packed my things that same day and left the cabin, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone and hear the wind howling, I swear I can still hear the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. Being home alone was never a big deal for me. My parents often went out for date nights or to visit friends, leaving me to my own devices. I loved the freedom, blasting music, eating junk food, and binge-watching whatever I wanted. That night was no different. My parents were heading to a charity gala and wouldn't be back until late. I waved them off, ordered a pizza, and set up a movie marathon in the living room. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind that made you want to curl up with a blanket and ignore the world. The rain pattered against the windows, and the occasional rumble of thunder added a cozy backdrop to my evening. But by the time the second movie started, things began to feel off. I was halfway through my pizza when I heard it, a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen. I froze, the slice halfway to my mouth, and listened. The sound had come from the basement. The logical part of my brain told me it was nothing, maybe an old pipe settling or a box falling over. Our house was old, and the basement was full of random junk my parents had been meaning to clear out for years. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I muted the TV, straining to hear over the rain. For a moment, there was only silence. Then it happened again, a louder thud, followed by a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. Grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I made my way to the basement door. The air felt colder as I approached, and my hand hesitated on the doorknob. "Hello," I called, trying to sound confident. No answer. I opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly, and peered down the stairs. The basement was pitch black, the faint beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Step by step, I descended, the wooden stairs groaning under my weight. The smell of damp earth and mildew filled my nose, and the chill in the air made my skin prickle. I scanned the room with my flashlight. Everything looked normal, just the usual clutter of old furniture, cardboard boxes, and tools. Then I saw it. Near the far corner of the basement, behind an old couch, a pair of boots stuck out, partially hidden by shadows. My heart stopped. The boots were attached to legs. Someone was lying behind the couch, motionless. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure shifted slightly, and a man's face emerged from the shadows. His skin was pale and grimy, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stared at me, his expression somewhere between fear and rage. I screamed and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The operator tried to calm me as I explained what had happened. "Stay on the line," she said. "Officers are on their way." I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and locked myself in my bedroom, pressing my ear to the door. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving from the basement door to the living room. The creak of the floorboards was deafening in the silence. He was inside. I stifled a sob, holding my breath as the footsteps grew closer. For a moment, they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I gripped the knife tightly, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, the footsteps retreated. The flashing lights of the police cars were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The officers entered the house and found him hiding in the basement. He was filthy, clutching a small bag that contained a few stolen items, a watch, some jewelry, and a set of spare keys my dad had stored in the basement. But that wasn't the worst part. They found a journal in the bag, filled with notes about me, what time I left for school, when my parents were usually out, and even details about the clothes I wore around the house. He'd been watching me for weeks, planning his break-in for a night when I'd be home alone. I couldn't sleep for months after that. Every creak of the house sent me into a panic. My parents installed a security system, but it didn't help the feeling that I'd lost something that night, my sense of safety. To this day, I can't be home alone without triple-checking every lock and keeping a weapon nearby. The thought of him standing outside, watching and waiting, is a fear I'll never shake.